Let me tell you a story about what happens when someone who has everything realizes they have nothing at all. This is the story of Alexander Chen, and trust me, you're going to want to hear every single detail of what comes next. Picture this: 28 years old, $3 billion in the bank, and a corner office on the 42nd floor with a view that most people only see in movies. Alexander Chen built his tech empire from absolutely nothing after tragedy struck his life when he was just 19. His parents died in a car accident, and instead of crumbling under the weight of grief, he channeled every ounce of pain into creating Chen Industries. But here's what nobody tells you about having that kind of money, that kind of power. Everyone wants something from you. Every smile feels calculated. Every conversation has an agenda. Every relationship comes with terms and conditions that would make a lawyer dizzy. Alexander's latest relationship had just ended in spectacular fashion. Victoria Sinclair, a model whose Instagram followers outnumbered the population of some small countries, had tried to sell their private text messages to a tabloid for 6 figures. The headline would have read something like "Billionaire's Secret Fetish," when in reality, the most scandalous thing he had ever texted her was asking if she preferred Thai food or Italian for dinner. At night, sitting in his 12,000 square foot penthouse, surrounded by art pieces worth more than most people's houses, Alexander Chen made a decision that would have given his board of directors collective heart attacks. He was going to disappear. Not forever, just long enough to find out what it felt like to be wanted for who he was, not what his bank account looked like. The plan was simple in concept, revolutionary in execution. Alexander would become A.J. Miller, a regular guy with a regular job, living a regular life. He'd rent a tiny apartment, work for minimum wage, and discover what it felt like to be invisible in the best possible way. His assistant Marcus thought he was having the world's most expensive midlife crisis. His friends assumed the stress of running a billion-dollar company had finally cracked him. But Alexander had never felt more hopeful. Somewhere out there was someone who would fall for A.J. Miller, the guy making lattes and struggling to pay rent, not Alexander Chen, the billionaire hiding behind an apron. Now here's a question to get you thinking. If you had to hide who you really are to find true love, like A.J. did, what part of your life would you keep secret, and why? Drop your answer in the comments below. We can't wait to read your stories. Let's keep the love flowing at Agape Love Tales. Agape Love Tales is where romance comes alive, with stories of passion, secrets, and second chances that'll keep you hooked. Hit that like button, and subscribe to join our community of hopeless romantics. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a twist in our tales of love. He found a studio apartment in Capitol Hill that was smaller than his walk-in closet. The rent was $800 a month, which he used to spend on a single dinner. The walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbor's entire phone conversations, and the shower had exactly 2 settings, Arctic blast or surface of the sun. It was perfect. Getting a job proved more challenging than building a tech empire. Turns out, when you've never actually worked a service job, you don't have the references that convince people to hire you. Alexander, now A.J., must have applied to 30 places before Brew and Bean Coffee Shop took a chance on him. Brew and Bean was the kind of place that had character instead of a marketing budget. Exposed brick walls covered with local artwork, mismatched furniture that somehow worked perfectly together, and the smell of freshly roasted coffee beans that made you feel like you were part of something authentic. The owner, Frank Morrison, was a 60-year-old former engineer who'd opened the shop after his own corporate burnout 15 years earlier. Frank hired A.J. partly because he was desperate for help, and partly because something about this well-spoken guy with no coffee experience reminded him of his younger self. He had no idea he'd just given a job to someone who could buy his entire building with pocket change. If you've ever wondered what happens when someone who's used to having everything done for them tries to make a cappuccino, let me paint you a picture. Disaster. Pure, beautiful disaster. A.J.'s first day at Brew and Bean was like watching someone try to perform surgery with oven mitts. But here's the thing about starting over: every failure teaches you something new about yourself. A.J. discovered that he actually enjoyed the rhythm of customer service, the satisfaction of creating something with his hands, even if that something was occasionally undrinkable. 3 days into his new career as Seattle's most overpaid barista, everything changed. It was Tuesday morning, October 15th, at exactly 8:47 a.m. Not that A.J. was keeping track or anything, but some moments are so significant that they burn themselves into your memory with perfect clarity. Emma Rodriguez burst through the door like a hurricane wearing a sunshine yellow cardigan. 26 years old, kindergarten teacher, and currently running 15 minutes late for the most important day of her school year. Her class was going on their first field trip to the zoo, and she'd overslept because she'd spent the previous evening making 24 individual goodie bags for her students. Emma had the kind of face that made strangers smile without knowing why. Warm brown eyes that crinkled when she laughed, cheeks that held onto summer freckles year-round, and an energy that could power a small city. She was the type of person who remembered the names of grocery store clerks and always had spare change for the parking meter when yours ran out. She approached AJ's register counting coins like her life depended on it. Quarters, dimes, nickels. She was doing mathematical gymnastics to afford her usual medium latte. Teaching kindergarten didn't exactly come with a Silicon Valley salary, and the end of the month always meant choosing between coffee and lunch. Now remember, this is Alexander Chen we're talking about. A man who'd never had to count change in his entire adult life, watching someone stress over whether she could afford a $4 coffee. Something inside his chest twisted, a feeling he couldn't quite name but knew he didn't like. Emma finally looked up with an apologetic smile and ordered the smallest size on the menu. A small coffee, black, no additions. She was clearly trying to make her money stretch as far as possible. AJ nodded, turned to the espresso machine, and promptly created what could generously be called a coffee-adjacent beverage. What he handed her looked like it had been filtered through a gym sock and tasted like it had been personally insulted by coffee beans. Emma took one sip, and AJ watched her face go through a series of expressions that would have been hilarious if he wasn't dying of embarrassment. But here's where Emma Rodriguez showed exactly why she was special. Instead of complaining, instead of demanding a refund, instead of doing what any reasonable person would do when served what was essentially bean-flavored water, she smiled. Not a fake customer service smile, but a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. She asked if it was his first day. When AJ confirmed that it was painfully obvious, she did something that would replay in his mind for weeks to come. She offered to help. Not condescendingly, not with pity, but with the kind of natural kindness that some people are born with and others spend their whole lives trying to learn. For the next 10 minutes, Emma Rodriguez gave AJ Miller an impromptu barista lesson. She showed him how to time the espresso shots, how to steam milk without creating a foam mountain, and how to pour without looking like you're performing experimental art. She was patient, encouraging, and completely unaware that she was teaching a billionaire how to make coffee. More importantly, she was 15 minutes late for her own field trip, but she stayed to help a stranger who was clearly struggling. That's the kind of person Emma was, someone who would sacrifice her own schedule to make someone else's day a little easier. When she finally had to leave, practically sprinting out the door to catch up with her class, AJ stood behind the counter holding a cup of actually drinkable coffee and feeling like something fundamental had shifted in his universe. He didn't even know her name yet, but he knew he wanted to see her again. Emma, meanwhile, spent the entire bus ride to the zoo thinking about the new barista with the kind eyes and expensive-looking teeth. There was something about him that didn't quite fit, the way he held himself, the careful way he spoke, like he was thinking about each word before saying it. But mostly, she remembered how grateful he'd seemed for her help, how he'd looked at her like she was doing something extraordinary when really she was just being human. The next morning, Emma came back. Not because Brew and Bean was on her way to work, it actually added 10 minutes to her commute, but because she wanted to see how AJ was doing with the espresso machine. She told herself it was just good karma, helping out a fellow human being. She definitely wasn't thinking about his smile or the way he'd said thank you like he really meant it. AJ, for his part, had arrived at work 30 minutes early, practicing with the espresso machine like his life depended on it. When Emma walked through the door, his heart did something that his cardiologist probably would have found concerning. He'd been hoping she'd come back, but he hadn't let himself believe it would actually happen. This time, when Emma ordered her small black coffee, AJ did something that would have made his accountant weep. He upgraded her to a large latte, added an extra shot, threw in a blueberry muffin, and charged her for the small black coffee. When she protested that the order was wrong, he just shrugged and said the espresso machine was feeling generous today. Emma accepted the upgraded order with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. She stayed an extra 5 minutes, asking about his coffee training progress, sharing a story about one of her students who'd brought a pet hamster for show and tell without telling anyone. They talked like old friends, like people who'd known each other for years instead of minutes. This became their routine. Every morning at 8:47, Emma would appear at Brew and Bean. She'd order her small black coffee, AJ would give her something infinitely better, and they'd spend a few precious minutes talking about everything and nothing. Emma shared stories about her students, her dreams of opening a community center, her weekend adventures that usually involved farmers markets and hiking trails. AJ found himself living for these conversations. Emma had a way of making the mundane sound magical. She'd talk about how 5-year-old Marcus had decided he wanted to be a dinosaur paleontologist who also worked as a firefighter on weekends, and AJ would find himself laughing in ways he hadn't in years. These weren't the polite chuckles he gave during board meetings. These were real, from the belly laughs that made his sides ache. In return, AJ shared carefully edited stories about his life. He'd talk about his corporate job, which was technically true, and his struggle to find authentic connections in a world that often felt superficial. He couldn't tell her about boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, but he could tell her about feeling isolated and searching for something real. Emma listened with the kind of attention that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. By the end of the first week, Emma was bringing AJ homemade cookies. Not because she was trying to impress him, but because she'd made a batch for her class and had extras. She wrapped them in a paper towel with a note that said, "For the coffee warrior, may your espresso shots be strong and your milk foam be mighty." AJ treasured that note like it was a Pulitzer Prize. He kept it in his apron pocket and would touch it throughout the day whenever a difficult customer tested his patience or when the espresso machine decided to have a mechanical breakdown. It was a tangible reminder that someone saw him, not Alexander Chen, not a billionaire, not a CEO, just him. The second week brought new developments. Emma started teaching AJ latte art during her morning visits. She'd guide his hand as he poured steamed milk, showing him how to create hearts and leaves and occasionally something that resembled a swan if you squinted and used your imagination. Her hands were warm and steady, calloused from classroom projects and weekend gardening, and AJ found himself hoping his progress would be slow enough to justify continued lessons. Emma, meanwhile, was discovering that AJ was full of surprises. He knew things about business that seemed advanced for a barista, could discuss art and literature with a kind of insight that suggested expensive education, and had opinions about wine that went beyond red or white. When she asked about it, he'd deflect with humor, saying he'd had interesting roommates in college, or had picked things up from customers. The truth was, AJ was walking a tightrope between two worlds. During the day, he was learning to live on a barista's salary, discovering the art of grocery shopping with a budget, figuring out how to make ramen noodles feel like a gourmet meal. At night, he'd return to his tiny apartment and handle the absolutely essential CEO duties through encrypted emails and secure video calls with Marcus. Marcus was having what could generously be called a mental breakdown. His boss had disappeared into what he considered witness protection for rich people, and he was left explaining to the board of directors why their CEO was taking a sabbatical to explore new market opportunities. The fact that those market opportunities involved perfecting the foam-to-coffee ratio was information Marcus kept to himself. But AJ had never been happier. Every morning, he woke up excited about going to work, which was a feeling he hadn't experienced since the early days of building Chen Industries. The difference was that then, he'd been excited about conquering the world. Now, he was excited about seeing Emma's smile and hearing what adventures her kindergartners had gotten into. 3 weeks into his new life, something shifted between AJ and Emma. She'd arrived that morning looking uncharacteristically subdued, and when he asked if she was okay, she opened up about her struggles with her school's budget cuts. Her classroom supplies were being reduced, field trips were being canceled, and there was talk of eliminating some of the enrichment programs she'd worked so hard to develop. As Emma talked about her students and how these cuts would affect their education, AJ felt a familiar fire igniting in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had when he decided to build Chen Industries, the absolute certainty that this problem needed solving and he had the power to solve it. The difference was that this time, he couldn't just write a check. He had to be creative. That afternoon, after Emma left for school, AJ made a phone call that would have complicated implications he couldn't foresee. He called Marcus with instructions to set up a shell company and begin researching anonymous donation processes for public schools. If he couldn't help Emma directly, he'd help her indirectly. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Chen Industries would create a subsidiary focused on educational philanthropy. This subsidiary would identify struggling schools and provide targeted assistance through anonymous grants and donations. Emma's school would be the first beneficiary, but AJ was careful to ensure it wouldn't be the only one. That would be too suspicious. Within a week, Emma's school received notice of an unexpected windfall. An anonymous donor had provided funding for classroom supplies, field trips, and program expansion. The amount wasn't so large as to be suspicious, but it was enough to solve the immediate crisis and provide some breathing room for future planning. When Emma burst into Brew and Bean the next morning with tears of happiness streaming down her face, AJ felt something he'd never experienced before. Pure joy that came from making someone else happy without any expectation of recognition or reward. Emma was practically glowing as she told him about the donation, about how her students would be able to go to the Science Museum after all, about how she could finally buy the art supplies she'd been dreaming of. AJ listened with appropriate amazement, asked all the right questions, and celebrated with her like any good friend would. Inside, he was building a catalog of every expression that crossed her face, every gesture that showed her excitement. He was falling in love with her passion for teaching, her dedication to her students, her genuine belief that she could make the world better one 5-year-old at a time. That afternoon, Emma did something that would change everything between them. She asked if he wanted to get coffee somewhere else for once, maybe try out the competition and rate their espresso techniques. It was casual, friendly, completely innocent. It was also their first official time together outside of Brew and Bean, and both of them knew it. They ended up at a small cafe 3 blocks away, sharing a table by the window, rating different coffee shops on what they decided to call the AJ scale of espresso excellence. Emma was hilariously critical of other baristas' techniques, defending AJ's honor against perfectly competent coffee makers. AJ found himself falling deeper with every laugh, every opinion, every moment of her attention. 3 hours passed like 3 minutes. They talked about everything: Emma's childhood in a large Mexican-American family, her decision to become a teacher, her dreams of traveling to see the Northern Lights someday. AJ shared stories too, carefully edited versions of his life that focused on feelings rather than facts. He talked about losing his parents, about feeling disconnected from people, about wanting to find something real in a world that often felt artificial. When Emma insisted on paying for both their drinks because baristas don't make enough to be taking teachers out for expensive coffee, AJ felt something crack open in his chest. She was trying to take care of him, this woman who counted coins for her own morning latte, and she was doing it with such natural grace that he almost forgot to be touched by the gesture. As they walked back toward Brew and Bean, Emma slipped her hand into his like it was the most natural thing in the world. AJ's heart stopped, restarted, and then began beating in a rhythm he'd never experienced before. Her hand was small and warm, with paint under her fingernails from an art project with her students, and it fit perfectly in his like it had been designed specifically for that purpose. That night, AJ lay awake in his narrow Murphy bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the afternoon. Emma Rodriguez was everything he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. She was kind without being naive, strong without being hard, passionate about her work without being consumed by it. She saw the best in people, believed in possibilities, and had a laugh that could cure insomnia. More importantly, she liked AJ Miller. Not Alexander Chen with his billions and boardrooms, but AJ the barista who burned himself on steam wands and made latte art that looked like abstract expressionist accidents. She liked his stories, his sense of humor, his gradually improving coffee skills. For the first time in his adult life, someone was falling for him without any agenda beyond genuine affection. The next morning marked exactly 1 month since AJ had started working at Brew and Bean, and Emma surprised him with a small celebration. She brought cupcakes from her favorite bakery and a card that the kids in her class had made. 24 5-year-olds had drawn pictures of coffee cups with faces, and each one had written "Thank you Mr. AJ" in crayon letters that made his chest tight with emotion. Emma had told her students about the nice man who made her coffee every morning, how he was learning new skills and working hard to make people's days better. In the way that children do, they decided that anyone who made their teacher happy was worthy of their artistic efforts. AJ had never received anything more valuable than those crayon drawings. As Emma watched him look through each drawing with careful attention, something shifted in her chest too. She'd been fighting her growing feelings for weeks, telling herself that workplace crushes were unprofessional and that she barely knew this man. But watching him treat her students' artwork like precious artifacts, seeing the genuine emotion in his eyes, she realized she wasn't fighting a crush anymore. She was falling in love. That afternoon, after the coffee shop closed, AJ did something he'd never done before. He called Marcus and told him to cancel all meetings for the next day. He was taking his first sick day since becoming a barista, and he was going to spend it with Emma Rodriguez. Emma had mentioned that Saturdays were her favorite because she volunteered at the local community center, helping kids with reading and art projects. When AJ asked if she could use an extra pair of hands, her face lit up like he'd offered to solve world hunger. She said yes before he'd even finished asking the question. So there you have it, the end of Act 1. Alexander Chen, Billionaire CEO, was about to spend his Saturday finger painting with 8-year-olds and reading picture books about dinosaurs who wanted to be ballet dancers. He'd traded his corner office for a coffee shop, his designer suits for second-hand clothes, and his carefully curated social circle for one kindergarten teacher who saw magic in everyday moments. He had no idea that his carefully constructed new life was about to become infinitely more complicated. Emma Rodriguez was about to show him what real happiness looked like, which would make the inevitable moment of truth that much more devastating. Because the thing about falling in love while living a lie is that eventually, the truth has a way of surfacing. And when it did, it was going to change everything. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of autumn sunshine that makes everything look like it's been painted with golden honey. A.J. Miller, still getting used to answering to that name, stood outside the Riverside Community Center holding a box of donuts and wondering if it was possible to die from nervousness. This wasn't a board meeting with Fortune 500 executives. This was something infinitely more terrifying, spending the day in Emma Rodriguez's world, surrounded by the people and places that mattered most to her. The community center was exactly what you'd expect from a building that had been serving the neighborhood for 40 years on a budget held together with hope and duct tape. The paint was peeling in artistic patterns, the playground equipment had that well-loved look that spoke of thousands of children's adventures, and there was a hand-painted sign by the front door that read "All are welcome here" in letters that had been touched up so many times they become a rainbow of good intentions. Emma appeared in the doorway wearing paint-splattered jeans and a volunteer t-shirt that had seen better decades, and she was more beautiful than A.J. had ever seen her. This was Emma in her element, surrounded by the chaos of children's laughter and the controlled disaster of weekend art projects. When she saw him standing there with donuts, her smile could have powered the entire building. She introduced him to Maria Santos, the center director, who had the kind of presence that suggested she could referee a fight between professional wrestlers and somehow get them to apologize to each other afterward. Maria looked A.J. up and down with the practiced eye of someone who'd been evaluating potential volunteers for 2 decades, then handed him an apron covered in so much paint it looked like a Jackson Pollock masterpiece. The reading corner was where A.J. discovered something he'd never known about himself. He was surprisingly good with children. Maybe it was because kids don't care about your net worth or your business connections. They care about whether you can do funny voices when you read stories about dragons who are afraid of their own fire, and whether you're willing to let them paint your fingernails electric blue because it matches the butterfly they're creating. 8-year-old Sophia decided that A.J. needed to hear about her extensive research into unicorns, which apparently involved interviewing her grandmother, watching 17 YouTube videos, and conducting what she called field observations in her backyard. 6-year-old Marcus, not to be confused with A.J.'s increasingly frazzled assistant, was convinced that A.J. was secretly a superhero because he had the kind of smile that good guys have in movies. Emma watched from across the room as A.J. sat cross-legged on a carpet that had seen better years, surrounded by a semicircle of children hanging on his every word as he read a story about a bear who wanted to be a librarian. Something about the way he interacted with the kids, patient, engaged, genuinely interested in their wild theories about why grass is green and whether fish get thirsty, made her heart do things that probably violated several laws of physics. During lunch break, as they sat on the front steps sharing sandwiches that Emma had packed that morning, she told A.J. about her biggest dream. She wanted to create a place like this community center, but bigger, better, with proper funding and resources. A place where kids could come after school, during summers, anytime they needed somewhere safe to learn and grow and just be kids. As Emma described her vision, art studios with supplies that weren't donated leftovers, a library with books that didn't have pages missing, computers that were manufactured in this century, sports equipment that wasn't held together with athletic tape and prayers, A.J. found himself doing mental calculations. The kind of facility she was describing would cost maybe $2 million to set up properly, another $500,000 annually to run. For Alexander Chen, that was pocket change. For Emma Rodriguez, it was an impossible dream. Emma pulled out her phone and showed him pictures she'd taken of an empty lot 6 blocks away. It was currently home to weeds and the occasional stray cat, but she could see it transformed into everything she'd just described. She'd been walking past it every day for 2 years, imagining what it could become, calculating how much money she'd need to save, how many grants she'd need to write, how many fundraisers she'd need to organize. At the rate she was going, Emma calculated she might be able to afford the down payment on the property by the time she was 65. But she said it with the kind of determined optimism that suggested she was absolutely going to make it happen, even if it took her entire lifetime. That was the moment A.J. realized he wasn't just falling in love with Emma Rodriguez. He was falling in love with her dreams, her determination, her absolute refusal to let practical limitations kill her vision. That afternoon, 10-year-old Isabella taught AJ how to make friendship bracelets using embroidery floss and the kind of complex knotting techniques that would have impressed sailors. As his fingers fumbled with patterns that Isabella could create blindfolded, she told him about how Miss Emma had helped her family when her dad lost his job. Emma had quietly arranged for extra supplies to come home, had forgotten to collect payment for field trips, had somehow made sure Isabella never felt different from the other kids even when money was tight. These weren't grand gestures. Emma wasn't solving problems with dramatic flourishes or public recognition. She was just quietly, consistently making life a little better for everyone around her. She was using her own limited resources to fill gaps, spending her own money to buy supplies, staying late to help struggling students, and doing it all like it was the most natural thing in the world. By the end of the day, AJ's volunteer t-shirt looked like he'd been in a paint fight with a rainbow. He had glitter in his hair that would probably take weeks to completely disappear, and he'd learned more about the social dynamics of second graders than he'd ever thought possible. He'd also fallen completely, irrevocably head over heels in love with Emma Rodriguez and everything she represented. As they walked home in the golden light of late afternoon, Emma slipped her hand into his and told him that watching him with the kids had been like seeing a different side of him emerge. She said he had a natural way with children, a patience and kindness that couldn't be faked. She had no idea she was describing qualities that Alexander Chen had never known he possessed, skills that had been buried under years of corporate armor and boardroom battles. That night, AJ made a decision that would complicate everything. He called Marcus and instructed him to begin researching community center development, grant opportunities for youth programs, and the zoning requirements for the empty lot Emma had shown him. If he couldn't tell her who he really was, he could at least start laying the groundwork to make her dreams come true. Marcus, who had been handling increasingly bizarre requests from his missing-in-action CEO, added this to his growing list of projects that made absolutely no sense from a business perspective, but apparently made perfect sense from a "my boss has lost his mind, but I still need this job" perspective. He was beginning to suspect that Alexander's mysterious sabbatical involved either a breakdown or a woman. Possibly both. The following week brought a development that should have been wonderful, but instead filled AJ with a growing sense of dread. Emma was getting suspicious, not in a bad way, but in the way that intelligent people get when they start noticing patterns that don't quite add up. It started small. Emma noticed that AJ never seemed to stress about money the way most people working minimum wage jobs did. When the coffee shop's cash register broke and Frank had to close early, AJ didn't seem panicked about losing half a day's pay. When other employees complained about the cost of bus fare or groceries, AJ listened sympathetically but never joined in with his own financial struggles. Then there were the little things that didn't fit. AJ's teeth were too perfect for someone without dental insurance. His posture was too good for someone who'd never had etiquette training. He knew too much about wine, art, and international cuisine for someone who claimed to have grown up middle class in Ohio. When Emma mentioned a famous painting, AJ casually mentioned having seen it at a gallery opening, then quickly changed the subject. Emma's best friend Sophia was the first to voice what Emma was trying not to think about. They were having their weekly girls' night, painting each other's nails and watching terrible romantic comedies, when Sophia dropped the bomb that would change everything. Sophia Martinez had known Emma since college, had been her maid of honor at her sister's wedding, and had the kind of protective instincts that made her suspicious of any man who seemed too good to be true. She'd been watching Emma fall in love with increasing concern, not because she didn't want Emma to be happy, but because something about this whole situation felt off. Sophia pointed out that these amazing coincidences surrounding Emma's school had started right around the time AJ appeared in her life. The anonymous donation that solved the budget crisis, the mysterious grant that funded the field trips, the sudden appearance of new supplies that no one could quite explain, it was all very convenient timing. Emma's first instinct was to defend AJ, to explain away the coincidences, to insist that her friend was being paranoid. But late that night, alone in her apartment, she found herself thinking about all the little inconsistencies she'd noticed. The expensive watch AJ wore that he claimed was a gift from a grateful customer. The way he seemed to know exactly how to navigate complex business discussions. The careful way he talked about his past, always providing just enough detail to satisfy curiosity without ever really revealing anything substantial. Meanwhile, AJ was dealing with his own complications. His carefully constructed double life was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Chen Industries was preparing for a major product launch, and his absence was starting to cause problems that Marcus couldn't solve with creative scheduling and strategic delegation. The board of directors was asking questions that were becoming harder to answer. Investors wanted face-to-face meetings with the CEO who had mysteriously become unavailable for anything more than brief video calls from undisclosed locations. The financial press was starting to notice that Alexander Chen hadn't made a public appearance in over a month. AJ found himself working 2 full-time jobs, barista by day, CEO by night, and the strain was beginning to show. He'd fall asleep during late-night video conferences, then struggle to stay alert during the morning rush at Brew and Bean. Emma noticed his exhaustion and worried that he was working too hard, never imagining that her concerned boyfriend was actually running a billion-dollar company in his spare time. 3 weeks after their day at the community center, Emma received news that should have been the best moment of her life. An anonymous benefactor had expressed interest in funding her community center dream. Not just providing a small grant or donation, but actually purchasing the empty lot she'd shown AJ and building the facility exactly as she'd envisioned it. The letter arrived on official law firm letterhead, explaining that their client wished to remain anonymous but had been impressed by Emma's work with local children and wanted to support her vision. The proposed facility would include everything she dreamed of: art studios, a computer lab, a library, sports facilities, and programming space for after-school activities and summer camps. Emma should have been ecstatic. This was literally her impossible dream being handed to her by forces she couldn't understand or explain. Instead, she felt a growing unease that she couldn't shake. The timing was too perfect. The anonymous benefactor knew too many specific details about her vision. The whole situation felt orchestrated in a way that made her increasingly uncomfortable. When she told AJ about the letter, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He was thrilled for her, asked all the right questions, celebrated her incredible good fortune with the kind of genuine happiness that confirmed her feelings for him. But Emma was learning to read the subtle expressions that crossed his face, and for just a moment, she saw something that looked like relief mixed with pride. Not surprise, not amazement at her good fortune, but relief that a plan had worked exactly as intended. That night, Emma made a decision that would change everything. She was going to figure out who AJ Miller really was. Not because she didn't trust him, she trusted him completely, which was part of the problem. She trusted him enough to fall in love with him, but she was beginning to suspect that the person she'd fallen in love with wasn't entirely real. Emma started small, the way teachers do when they suspect a student isn't telling the whole truth about their homework. She asked casual questions about AJ's background, his family, his previous work experience. She paid attention to his answers, looking for inconsistencies or gaps that might reveal whatever he was hiding. AJ, meanwhile, was struggling with his own moral crisis. Every day that passed made him love Emma more, but it also made his deception feel more unforgivable. He was living the happiest period of his adult life while building it on a foundation of lies that grew more complex with each passing day. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in November. Emma had invited AJ to dinner at her apartment. Nothing fancy, just homemade pasta and a bottle of wine that had cost her 3 days of careful budgeting. They were sitting on her tiny couch, her head on his shoulder, talking about their plans for the weekend, when Emma asked the question that would shatter everything. She asked him to tell her something real about himself. Not his favorite color or his coffee preferences, but something that mattered. Something true and significant that would help her understand who he really was beneath all the careful deflections and edited stories. AJ felt his heart stop. This was the moment he'd been dreading and longing for in equal measure. Emma was giving him the opportunity to come clean, to trust her with the truth, to find out if what they had was strong enough to survive the revelation of who he really was. For a moment, he almost did it. Almost told her that he was Alexander Chen, that he'd been living a lie because he was desperate to find someone who could love him for who he was rather than what he owned. Almost explained that every anonymous donation, every convenient coincidence, every miracle that had improved her life had been orchestrated by a man who loved her so much he was willing to become someone else entirely just to deserve her. Instead, AJ told Emma about losing his parents. Not the carefully edited version he'd shared before, but the real story. The phone call that changed everything. The funeral where he'd stood alone in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, the years of therapy and medication and sleepless nights as he tried to build something meaningful from the wreckage of his grief. He told her about the loneliness that had driven him to create Chen Industries, how building something from nothing had been the only way to make his parents' death mean something. He told her about the isolation that came with success, the way money had created walls between him and every relationship he tried to build. It was all true, every word of it. It just wasn't complete. Emma held him as he talked, her heart breaking for the pain he'd experienced, not knowing that the man she was comforting owned more wealth than some small countries. She thought she was falling in love with A.J. Miller, a barista with a tragic past and a gentle heart. She had no idea she was falling in love with one of the most successful businessmen in the country. That night, as Emma fell asleep in his arms, A.J. made a decision that would seal both their fates. He was going to find a way to tell her the truth. Not immediately, he needed time to figure out how to do it without losing her forever, but soon. Emma Rodriguez deserved honesty from the man who loved her, and Alexander Chen was finally ready to risk everything to give it to her. What A.J. didn't know was that Emma had already started looking for answers on her own. The next morning, while he was at work perfecting his latte art and serving coffee to customers who had no idea they were being served by a billionaire, Emma was sitting in the local library with Sophia, using the public computers to search for any information about A.J. Miller that might explain the growing list of inconsistencies in his story. Sophia had brought her laptop and her natural talent for internet investigation. If A.J. Miller was hiding something, they were going to find out what it was. Emma told herself she was doing this to protect her heart, to make sure she wasn't being played by someone with ulterior motives. The truth was, she was doing it because she was already so in love with him that the thought of discovering he wasn't who he claimed to be was almost unbearable. They started with basic searches, social media profiles, employment records, anything that might confirm the story A.J. had told her about his background. What they found was troubling in its absence. A.J. Miller, as Emma knew him, barely existed in any official capacity. No Facebook profile, no Instagram account, no digital footprint that matched the man she'd been dating for 2 months. Sophia, who worked in digital marketing and understood how difficult it was to exist online without leaving traces, found this absence suspicious. She expanded her search, looking for any Miller who might match A.J.'s description, any corporate records that might explain his apparent knowledge of business practices. That's when she found the first photograph of Alexander Chen. It was from a business magazine article published 6 months earlier, showing the young CEO at some corporate event, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than Emma's monthly salary. The man in the photograph looked familiar in a way that made Sophia's heart sink. She spent the next hour searching for more images, more articles, more information about Alexander Chen and Chen Industries. With each new photograph, each new story about his business success, each new detail about his wealth and influence, the truth became undeniable. A.J. Miller, the struggling barista who had stolen Emma's heart, was actually Alexander Chen, Billionaire CEO. Emma stared at the computer screen, looking at photographs of the man she loved dressed in designer suits, shaking hands with world leaders, giving speeches at conferences that cost more to attend than she made in a year. This was A.J., her A.J., but it was also a complete stranger. The worst part wasn't discovering that he'd lied about who he was. The worst part was understanding why he'd lied. Every anonymous donation, every convenient grant, every miracle that had improved her life, it had all come from him. He hadn't fallen in love with her and then decided to help. He'd been orchestrating her happiness from the very beginning, using his wealth to manipulate her circumstances while pretending to be someone who could barely afford coffee. Emma felt like she was going to be sick. Everything she'd thought was real, every moment of genuine connection, every feeling of mutual attraction and organic relationship building, it was all based on a lie so fundamental that she didn't know which parts of their relationship had been authentic. Sophia watched her best friend process the betrayal, saw the exact moment Emma's heart broke, and wished she'd never started looking for answers. Sometimes ignorance really was bliss, especially when the truth was this devastating. Emma closed the laptop and sat in the library parking lot for 20 minutes, crying in her car while trying to figure out what she was supposed to do with this information. Part of her wanted to confront A.J. immediately, to demand explanations and answers. Part of her wanted to disappear, to never see him again, to pretend she'd never learned the truth. But Emma Rodriguez was not someone who ran from difficult conversations, even when they threatened to destroy everything she'd thought was real. She was going to face this head-on, the way she faced everything else in her life. She was going to give A.J. Alexander, whoever he really was, the chance to explain himself before she decided whether their relationship was worth saving or if it had been a beautiful illusion from the very beginning. That afternoon, A.J. noticed that something was different about Emma's usual visit to the coffee shop. She seemed distracted, distant, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time and wasn't entirely pleased with what she was discovering. When he asked if everything was okay, she said they needed to talk. Not the casual kind of talking they did every morning, but serious, relationship-defining conversation. They made plans to meet at her apartment that evening. Emma said she'd cook dinner, that they needed privacy for what she wanted to discuss. AJ agreed, his heart already racing with a mixture of hope and terror. Maybe she'd figured out the truth on her own. Maybe this was finally the moment when he could stop living a double life and find out if Emma Rodriguez could love Alexander Chen as much as she'd loved AJ Miller. As the day progressed and evening approached, both Emma and AJ prepared for a conversation that would change everything between them. Neither of them knew exactly how it would unfold, but both of them understood that their relationship as it currently existed was about to end. The only question was whether what emerged from the ashes of AJ Miller would be strong enough to support the weight of the truth. The stage was set for a confrontation that had been building since the moment Alexander Chen first put on an apron and pretended to be someone he wasn't. Emma Rodriguez was about to discover just how far someone would go in the name of love, and Alexander Chen was about to learn whether his carefully constructed fantasy could survive contact with reality. What neither of them could predict was just how much pain two people could inflict on each other while genuinely believing they were doing the right thing. Love, it turns out, is not always enough to overcome deception, no matter how well-intentioned that deception might be. 7 o'clock arrived with the kind of autumn chill that makes you want to stay inside with someone you love, wrapped in blankets and sharing stories that matter. Emma Rodriguez had spent the afternoon cooking lasagna from scratch, not because the situation called for comfort food, but because she needed something to do with her hands while her mind processed what she was about to do to the man she loved. AJ arrived at Emma's apartment carrying flowers, not expensive roses from some fancy florist, but sunflowers from the corner market, bright and cheerful and completely inappropriate for what was about to become the most devastating conversation of both their lives. He'd chosen sunflowers because Emma had once mentioned that they reminded her of her grandmother's garden, and he'd been storing that information away like the treasure it was. Emma opened the door wearing the yellow dress that AJ had complimented on their third coffee date, and for a moment, the weight of what she discovered seemed to lift from her shoulders. This was still AJ, still the man who remembered how she liked her coffee and who had spent an entire Saturday finger painting with children he'd never met before. The problem was, she no longer knew where AJ Miller ended and Alexander Chen began. They sat down to dinner and made small talk about their days, both of them carefully avoiding the elephant that had taken up residence in Emma's tiny dining room. AJ told her about a customer who tried to order a coffee milkshake and seemed genuinely confused when the espresso machine couldn't accommodate the request. Emma shared a story about 5-year-old Marcus bringing his pet hamster to school again, this time hidden in his lunchbox. Under normal circumstances, these stories would have had them both laughing, sharing the kind of comfortable intimacy that couples develop when they truly enjoy each other's company. Tonight, every word felt like they were speaking different languages, like there were meanings hidden beneath meanings that neither of them could quite access. After dinner, as they sat on Emma's couch with cups of coffee that AJ had made using her ancient French press, Emma took a deep breath and asked the question that would change everything between them forever. She asked him to tell her about Alexander Chen and Chen Industries, and to explain why a billionaire CEO was pretending to be a barista named AJ Miller. The coffee cup slipped from AJ's hands, spilling across Emma's coffee table and seeping into the stack of graded papers she'd left there earlier. For a moment, the only sound in the apartment was the tick of the vintage clock Emma's grandmother had left her, marking seconds that felt like hours as AJ processed the fact that his carefully constructed world had just collapsed entirely. AJ Alexander, whoever he was in that moment, looked at Emma with an expression that cycled through surprise, relief, terror, and something that might have been gratitude. The burden of living two lives had been crushing him for weeks, and part of him was almost grateful that the decision of when and how to reveal the truth had been taken out of his hands. He started talking, and once he began, the words poured out like water from a burst dam. He told Emma everything, about the loneliness that had driven him to create this elaborate deception, about his desperate need to find someone who could love him for who he was rather than what he owned, about the terror that had kept him from revealing the truth even as their relationship deepened. Alexander explained how he'd carefully researched normal people's lives, how he'd practiced being unremarkable, how he'd learned to worry about things like rent and bus fare that had never concerned him before. He told her about the joy he'd found in their simple routines, in conversations that weren't about stock prices or market projections, in being valued for his kindness rather than his bank account. He told her about the first time she'd counted coins for coffee, how watching her stress over $4 had made him physically ill with the knowledge that he could solve every financial problem in her life without even noticing the expense. He explained how the anonymous donations had started as a way to ease her burdens without revealing his identity, how each gesture had been motivated by love rather than manipulation. Emma listened in silence, her face cycling through emotions that Alexander couldn't read. She was processing not just the magnitude of his deception, but the realization that every miracle in her recent life had been orchestrated by the man sitting across from her. The school funding, the community center project, probably dozens of small interventions she'd never even noticed, all of it had come from him. When Alexander finally stopped talking, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Emma stared at the coffee stain spreading across her papers, thinking about how appropriate it was that something precious was being ruined by the aftermath of revelations she wasn't sure she'd wanted to hear. Finally, Emma spoke, and her voice was quieter than Alexander had ever heard it. She asked him if any of it had been real. Not the money, not the elaborate setup, not the carefully constructed identity, but the feelings between them. Had A.J. Miller's love for Emma Rodriguez been genuine, or was even that part of some elaborate game she didn't understand? Alexander's response was immediate and fierce. Everything between them had been real, every laugh, every conversation, every moment of connection. A.J. Miller might have been a fiction, but his feelings for Emma had been the most authentic thing in Alexander Chen's life. He'd fallen in love with her kindness, her passion, her ability to find joy in simple things. None of that had been calculated or planned. But Emma was struggling with a different realization. She explained that while his feelings might have been real, the relationship itself had been built on fundamentally unequal ground. He'd known everything about her real circumstances, while she'd known nothing about his. He'd had the power to solve her problems, to manipulate her environment, to ensure that their story unfolded exactly as he wanted it to. Emma told him about the past 2 months, about how she'd fallen in love with the idea of being with someone who understood struggle, who valued the same things she did, who was building a life alongside her rather than above her. She'd thought they were partners in figuring out how to make ends meet, how to find happiness without money, how to build something meaningful from modest resources. Instead, she'd been performing poverty while he'd been performing normalcy, and the whole time he'd been orchestrating their lives from a position of power she hadn't even known existed. Every moment of financial stress he'd witnessed, every sacrifice she'd made in his presence, every time she'd worried about money while he was there, it had all been theater to him, problems he could solve with a phone call whenever he chose. Alexander tried to explain that he'd never seen her struggles as entertainment, that witnessing her financial stress had been torture for him. But Emma pointed out that if it had really been torture, he could have ended it at any time. He'd chosen to let her worry about rent and groceries and field trip fees while he played at being poor, and that choice revealed something about his character that she wasn't sure she could forgive. The conversation continued for hours, cycling through anger and hurt and desperate attempts at understanding. Alexander begged Emma to see that his deception had been motivated by love, not cruelty. Emma tried to explain that intention didn't erase impact, that being lied to by someone she trusted completely had shattered something inside her that might never fully heal. By midnight, they were both exhausted by the weight of everything that had been said and everything that remained unspeakable between them. Emma asked Alexander to leave, not forever, but until she could figure out how to process what she'd learned. She needed time to separate her feelings for A.J. Miller from her growing understanding of Alexander Chen, to decide whether their relationship could survive the death of the person she'd thought she was in love with. Alexander left Emma's apartment that night carrying the sunflowers she'd forgotten to put in water, knowing that he might never be welcome there again. He'd gotten what he'd claimed to want, someone who knew exactly who he was and had seen him at his most vulnerable. The problem was that the revelation had destroyed the very relationship he'd been trying to protect. The next morning, Emma called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. She spent the day in bed, alternating between crying and staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how someone could break your heart while genuinely believing they were protecting it. She'd lost not just her boyfriend, but her faith in her own judgment, her confidence that she could tell the difference between authenticity and performance. Alexander, meanwhile, didn't go to Brew and Bean. He couldn't face Frank's kind questions about why he looked like he'd been hit by a truck, couldn't pretend to care about coffee orders when his entire world had just imploded. Instead, he returned to his penthouse for the first time in months, walking through rooms that felt like a museum of the person he'd been before Emma Rodriguez changed everything. The luxury that had once felt like success now felt like isolation. The view that had once impressed him now seemed like a barrier between him and the real world. The art and furniture and carefully curated lifestyle that had once defined his identity now felt like props in a play he no longer wanted to perform. For the next week, Alexander threw himself back into running Chen Industries with a kind of manic energy that his employees hadn't seen since the early days of the company. He worked 18-hour days, scheduled back-to-back meetings, traveled to 3 different cities for conferences and presentations. He was trying to exhaust himself into forgetting Emma Rodriguez, but every quiet moment brought her back with devastating clarity. Emma, meanwhile, was learning what it felt like to have her dreams fulfilled by someone who'd broken her heart. The community center project was moving forward exactly as planned, with contractors and architects and planners who had no idea that their anonymous benefactor was a man Emma couldn't bear to see or think about. She tried to return the funding, to cancel the project, to distance herself from anything connected to Alexander Chen. But the lawyers explained that the donation structure made it impossible for her to refuse the money without shutting down programs that dozens of children were already depending on. She was trapped in a gilded cage of Alexander's generosity, unable to escape the constant reminder of what she'd lost. 3 weeks after their confrontation, Emma made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She submitted her resignation from the teaching position she'd held for 4 years, citing personal reasons and the need for a change in direction. Her principal, her fellow teachers, and her students' parents were devastated by the loss of someone who'd brought such passion and creativity to her work. Emma couldn't explain that she needed to start over completely, that staying in the same job in the same city with the same routines felt like being haunted by the ghost of her relationship with A.J. Miller. Every morning coffee run, every walk past Brew and Bean, every reminder of the life she'd been building felt contaminated by the knowledge of how carefully it had all been orchestrated. She decided to move to Portland, where her sister lived, where she could take some time to figure out who Emma Rodriguez was when she wasn't being influenced by the invisible hand of a billionaire's affection. She needed to rebuild her sense of agency, to prove to herself that she could create a meaningful life without anyone's assistance. Alexander learned about Emma's resignation through a private investigator's report that Marcus had commissioned without his permission. Marcus was worried about his boss's deteriorating mental state and thought that information about Emma might help Alexander find some kind of closure. Instead, learning that she was leaving Seattle sent Alexander into a spiral of regret and desperation. The night before Emma's scheduled departure, Alexander made a decision that would have shocked every board member who'd ever worked with him. He called an emergency meeting and submitted his own resignation as CEO of Chen Industries, effective immediately. He was walking away from the company he'd built, the empire he'd created from nothing, the identity that had defined his entire adult life. The boardroom erupted in chaos. Alexander Chen was Chen Industries. His vision, his leadership, his reputation were inextricably linked with the company's success. His sudden resignation could tank the stock price, destroy investor confidence, and unravel years of careful growth and development. But Alexander was beyond caring about stock prices or investor confidence. He explained to his board that he was liquidating his personal assets, transferring his shares to a trust, and restructuring his entire financial portfolio in ways that would permanently reduce his wealth and influence. He was choosing love over money, relationship over empire, Emma Rodriguez over Alexander Chen. The liquidation process took 6 months to complete properly, during which Alexander lived in a modestly furnished apartment and worked as a substitute teacher in Seattle's public school system. He discovered, during his time at the community center, that he actually enjoyed working with children, and teaching felt like a way to honor the values Emma had tried to instill in him. Every day, Alexander hoped he might see Emma around the city, might have a chance to show her how completely he'd changed his life. But Emma had kept her word about leaving Seattle, and the private investigator reports confirmed that she was building a new life in Portland, working at a small nonprofit that provided educational resources to underserved communities. 8 months after their devastating confrontation, Alexander received news that would test every decision he'd made since that night in Emma's apartment. Chen Industries, without his leadership, was struggling. The board had made a series of questionable decisions, the stock price had fallen dramatically, and there were rumors of potential bankruptcy if the trajectory couldn't be reversed. Alexander's former colleagues, his investors, and his business associates all pressed him to return to save the company he'd built. They offered him unprecedented compensation packages, complete creative control, and guarantees that he could restructure the company however he wanted. Returning to Chen Industries would restore his wealth, his status, and his influence practically overnight. For approximately 30 seconds, Alexander was tempted. The life he'd worked so hard to walk away from was being offered back to him on terms that were more attractive than anything he'd ever been offered before. He could reclaim everything he'd given up, return to the world where his decisions affected thousands of people and millions of dollars. Instead, Alexander wrote a letter to the board declining their offer and recommending a slate of capable executives who could guide the company through its current difficulties. He wished them well, thanked them for the opportunity to build something meaningful, and explained that his priorities had changed in ways that made returning impossible. That same week, Alexander made an even more significant decision. He drove to Portland with a manila envelope containing legal documents that would change both his and Emma's lives forever. He'd restructured the community center project, transferring complete ownership and control to Emma Rodriguez and establishing an endowment that would fund operations indefinitely without requiring any ongoing connection to Alexander Chen or his former business interests. Alexander found Emma at the small nonprofit where she worked, emerging from a meeting with a group of parents who were advocating for better after-school programming in their neighborhood. She looked exactly the same and completely different, still beautiful, still passionate about helping children, but carrying herself with a confidence and independence that hadn't been there before. When Emma saw Alexander standing in the parking lot of her workplace, her first instinct was to walk in the other direction. 8 months of healing and growth and rebuilding her sense of self hadn't erased the complex feelings she had about the man who'd loved her enough to lie to her and generous enough to break her heart. But Emma Rodriguez had never been someone who avoided difficult conversations, and she was curious about what could have brought Alexander Chen to Portland after months of silence. She agreed to have coffee with him, not at the romantic little cafe where they'd shared their first unofficial date, but at a busy chain restaurant where their conversation would be buffered by the noise and activity of strangers. Alexander handed Emma the manila envelope and explained what it contained: complete legal ownership of the community center, an endowment that would ensure its operations could continue indefinitely, and his complete removal from any involvement in the project. He'd given her the tools to create exactly the kind of facility she dreamed of, with no strings attached and no ongoing connection to him. More importantly, Alexander told Emma about the choices he'd made in the months since their confrontation. He'd resigned from Chen Industries, liquidated his assets, and completely restructured his life around values that she'd helped him discover. He wasn't trying to win her back. He understood that too much damage had been done for that to be possible. He was trying to show her that her influence on his life had been real and lasting. Emma listened to Alexander's explanation with the kind of careful attention she'd always given to important conversations. She asked questions about his decision-making process, his adjustment to a simpler lifestyle, his plans for the future. She was processing not just his words, but the evidence of how fundamentally he'd changed since she'd last seen him. The Alexander Chen sitting across from her was wearing clothes from Target instead of custom-tailored suits. He drove a used Honda instead of luxury cars. He talked about his substitute teaching work with the same enthusiasm he'd once reserved for billion-dollar business deals. This wasn't the carefully constructed performance that A.J. Miller had been. This was someone who'd genuinely transformed his priorities and lifestyle. Emma found herself remembering why she'd fallen in love with A.J. Miller in the first place. Stripped of the deception and the power imbalance, Alexander Chen was still someone who was kind to children, who listened to her dreams with genuine interest, who wanted to make the world better in whatever way he could. The problem was that she no longer knew whether she could trust her own judgment about who he really was. Their coffee conversation lasted for 3 hours, covering everything from Alexander's adjustment to living on a teacher's salary to Emma's new work with Portland's underserved communities. They were talking like old friends who'd shared something significant, which in many ways was exactly what they were. As they prepared to leave, Emma made a decision that surprised both of them. She invited Alexander to see the community center when it was completed. Not as a romantic gesture, not as a step toward reconciliation, but as acknowledgement that his gift was going to make a real difference in children's lives, and she thought he should see the impact of his generosity. Alexander accepted the invitation with the kind of careful gratitude that suggested he understood exactly what Emma was and wasn't offering. She was giving him closure, a chance to see that his mistakes had ultimately contributed to something positive, but she wasn't offering him a second chance at the relationship they'd lost. 6 months later, the Rivera Community Center, named after Emma's grandmother, opened its doors for the first time. The facility was everything Emma had dreamed of and more: bright classrooms filled with art supplies and books, a computer lab with equipment that wouldn't need replacing for years, sports facilities that could accommodate everything from basketball to dance classes. Alexander attended the opening ceremony as one of dozens of community members celebrating the new facility. He wasn't introduced as the anonymous benefactor. That secret remained between him and Emma, but he was there to see children racing through hallways that had once existed only in Emma's imagination. During the ceremony, Emma gave a speech about community support and the power of believing in children's potential. She thanked the anonymous donor who'd made the facility possible, and for just a moment, her eyes found Alexander in the crowd. The look that passed between them wasn't romantic or longing. It was acknowledgement, gratitude, and a kind of peace that hadn't existed between them before. After the ceremony, As families explored the new facility and children tested every piece of equipment they could find, Emma and Alexander found themselves alone in what would become the reading corner. It was furnished with comfortable chairs and filled with books, exactly like the corner where AJ had first read stories to children at the old community center. They stood there for several minutes without speaking, both of them remembering the Saturday when Alexander had discovered his talent for working with children, when Emma had first seen him as someone who could be part of her world. That day felt like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to different people who no longer existed. Finally, Emma broke the silence by thanking Alexander for the gift he'd given not just to her, but to the community. The center was already serving over 100 children, providing after-school programs, summer camps, and family resources that had been desperately needed in the neighborhood. Alexander told Emma that seeing the center filled with children and families was worth every sacrifice he'd made to create it. This was what he'd wanted his wealth to accomplish: real impact on real people's lives, rather than just accumulation for its own sake. Emma had taught him what it meant to use resources purposefully, and he was grateful for that lesson even if it had come at such a high personal cost. Heading home, Emma walked Alexander to his car, the same used Honda he'd been driving in Portland, proof that his transformation hadn't been temporary or strategic. They stood in the parking lot of the community center that represented both the best and worst of their relationship, saying goodbye in a way that felt final. Alexander told Emma that he'd never regretted loving her, even though that love had caused them both tremendous pain. She'd changed him in ways that would influence every decision he made for the rest of his life, and he was grateful for that gift even if he couldn't keep her. Emma responded that she'd never regretted falling in love with the person AJ Miller had been, even though learning about Alexander Chen had broken her heart. The relationship had taught her things about herself, about love, about the difference between being cared for and being truly known, that had made her stronger and more sure of what she wanted from life. They hugged goodbye like old friends who'd shared something important, and Alexander drove back to Seattle knowing that this was probably the last time he'd see Emma Rodriguez. She was building a beautiful life in Portland, surrounded by work that fulfilled her and people who knew exactly who she was. She didn't need his love or his resources or his grand gestures. She'd learned to create meaning and happiness entirely on her own terms. 2 years later, Alexander received a wedding invitation that made him smile despite the complicated emotions it stirred up. Emma was marrying David Chen, no relation to Alexander, despite the shared surname, a social worker she'd met through her nonprofit work. The invitation included a photo of the couple at the Rivera Community Center, surrounded by children who clearly adored them both. Alexander sent a wedding gift, not money or anything elaborate, but a first edition of the book about the bear who wanted to be a librarian that he'd read to children during his volunteer days. The card simply said, "For the reading corner of whatever home you build together," and was signed AJ. Emma understood the gift and the signature, recognizing them as Alexander's way of honoring the best parts of who he'd been when they were together while acknowledging the reality of who they'd both become. She kept the book in the special collection at the community center, where volunteers read it to children who would never know its history but would benefit from its message about following dreams that seem impossible. Alexander continued teaching, eventually earning his education credentials and becoming a full-time elementary school teacher in Seattle. He was good at it, popular with students and parents, known for his patience and creativity and willingness to spend his own money on classroom supplies when the school budget fell short. He never married, though he dated occasionally and maintained friendships with colleagues who knew him simply as Alex Miller, a dedicated teacher who'd had some unspecified success in business before finding his true calling in education. He was content with his life, fulfilled by work that mattered, surrounded by people who valued him for his character rather than his bank account. Sometimes, usually late at night when he was grading papers or planning lessons, Alexander would think about the path that had led him from a penthouse office to a classroom covered in student artwork. He'd remember Emma Rodriguez and the way she'd laughed at his terrible latte art, the way she'd treated him like he mattered when he was just AJ Miller, struggling barista. He'd learned that love wasn't about grand gestures or solving someone else's problems with money. Love was about being genuinely seen and valued, about building something real together, about trust that couldn't be purchased or manufactured. Emma had taught him those lessons, even though learning them had cost him the relationship he'd wanted most. In the end, Alexander Chen's love story with Emma Rodriguez wasn't the fairy tale ending that either of them had initially imagined. But it was real, and it was transformative, and it had made both of them better people even though it hadn't made them a couple. Sometimes the most important love stories are the ones that teach us who we want to become, rather than the ones that give us who we think we want to be with. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the person who breaks your heart also sets you free to build exactly the life you were meant to live. Emma Rodriguez and Alexander Chen had given each other that gift, wrapped in pain and tied with regret, but precious nonetheless. Hey, love story enthusiasts! If your heart's still racing from Alexander and Emma's meet-cute in Billionaire CEO pretends to be poor to find true love, then you're in the right place. Agape Love Tales is where romance comes alive, with stories of passion, secrets, and second chances that'll keep you hooked. Hit that like button if AJ and Emma's spark made you smile, and subscribe to join our community of hopeless romantics. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a twist in our tales of love.